don't know if you've ever been on a cruise, if you have or haven't, but every single morning they give you a list of every single activity that's taken place on the ship. First time I worked a cruise ship, 1999, I had no idea what LGBT gathering was, but I thought, man, they meet in a bar every night. I bet I belong to that group. LGBT's got to stand for Let's Get Blasted Together. I bet I belong to this group.
Good morning. It's Sunday. Thank God it's Sunday, August the 27th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have No Free Lunch, The Rape of the Mind, Rules for Retrogrades, and Bishop-barron. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
The disdain of profit is due to ignorance and to an attitude that we may, if we wish, admire in the ascetic who has chosen to be content with a small share of the riches of this world, but which, when actualized in the form of restrictions on profits of others, is selfish to the extent that it imposes asceticism and indeed deprivations of all sorts on others. F.A. Hayek. It should always strike us as painfully odd that those who claim to reject the profit motive, who claim to strive for material humility, who claim to prize the beautiful over the opulent, would be so audacious as to apply their self-imposed preferences on others. There is nothing noble or righteous about imposing on others the virtue signaling you have chosen for yourself.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you, and a quote from Ayn Rand. It is the fear of responsibility that prompts most people to adopt an attitude of indiscriminate moral neutrality. It is the fear best expressed in the precept, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." But that precept, in fact, is an abdication of moral responsibility. It is a moral blank check we give to others in exchange for a moral blank check that we expect for ourselves. There is no escape from the fact that we have to make choices. So long as we have to make choices, there is no escape from moral values. So long as moral values are at stake, no moral neutrality is possible. If we abstain from condemning a torturer, then we become an accessory to the torture and murder of the torture's victims. Unquote. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
The trial as an instrument of intimidation. Man's suggestibility can be a severe liability to him and to his democratic freedom, in still another important respect. Even when there is no deliberate attempt to manipulate public opinion, the controlled discussion of legal actions, such as political or criminal trials, in newspaper headlines and in partisan columns, helps to create a collective emotional atmosphere. This makes it difficult for those directly involved to maintain their much-needed objectivity and to render a verdict according to facts rather than suggestions and subjective experiences. In addition, any judicial process which receives widespread publicity exerts mental pressure on the public at large. Thus, not only the participant, but the entire citizenry can become emotionally involved in the proceedings. Any trial can be either an act of power or an act of truth. An apparently objective examination may become a weapon of control simply by the action of the suggestions that inevitably accompany it. As an act of power by a totalitarian government, the trial can have frightening consequences. The Moscow Purge trials and the German Reichstag fire case are prime examples. We do not, of course, have such horrifying travesties on justice in this country, but our tendency to turn legal actions into a field day for the newspapers, the radio, and television weakens our capacity to arrive at justice and truth. It would be better if we postponed discussion of the merits of any legal case until after the verdict was in. As we've already seen, any man can be harassed into a confession. The cruel process of menticide is not only the way to arrive at this goal. A man can be held guilty merely by accusation, especially when he was too weak to oppose the impact of collective ire in public opinion. In circumstances of abnormal fear and prejudice, men feel the need for a scapegoat more strongly than at other times. Consequently, people can easily be duped by false accusations which satisfy their need to have someone to blame. Victims of lynch mobs in our own country have been thus sacrificed to mass passion, and so have some so-called traitors and collaborators. In public opinion, the trial itself becomes the verdict of guilt.
And that was The Trial as an Instrument of Intimidation from the Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rule 3 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
No truth is off limits. We must never be ashamed to be candid. Radicals have successfully convinced many mod cons to self-censor, insisting that some truths are too offensive to be spoken in decent society. They've thus driven the retrograde message underground, forcing us to whisper in darkness a host of medicinal truths deserving of the limpid radiance of day. Should retrogrades continue to submit to such treacherous advice, we are destined to be routed in our fight for the soul of society. We know on the highest authority that apart from being desirable for its own sake, the truth shall set mankind free. And thus it is to be pursued at all costs. If sheepish mod cons neglect to fiercely and openly denounce the perversities that radicals are attempting to usher in, radicals will triumph by default. Darkness can only prevail when men of goodwill are made afraid to light a candle. It is of paramount importance to remember that acts of the intellect always precede acts of the will. In other words, before we act for a certain end, the intellect, consciously or not, must decide that such an end is the good, the object most worthy of our pursuit. No one sets out to achieve what he views as an inferior or bad end. Thus, in order to win the culture, we must boldly and loudly speak truth, so our fellow men can first recognize what is verily good, and subsequently firmly set their wills on achieving it. If something is true, then we have a duty to say it, so that society will be built on a foundation of rock instead of a foundation of sand. Be reminded that there is no such thing as an intrinsically hateful truth. Motive is always a deciding factor in analyzing the morality of a seemingly harsh statement. Sometimes charity and prudence dictate that one should even call his own mother fat. Perhaps she is a diabetic or has heart disease, and hearing such a hard truth will allow her to reformulate her diet and add years to her life. More important yet, perhaps she is a glutton, needing chastisement against a habituated mortal sin. Similarly, we do no one any favors when we, out of fear of being slandered as racist, sexist, jingoistic, homophobic, intolerant, or hateful, or any other empty, radical scare words, consent to hide the light of unpopular truths under a bushel basket. When we fail to acknowledge sensitive truths, e.g., that contemporary American black fatherlessness is linked with their disproportionately high crime rates, that single motherhood is ruinous for children, that unchecked immigration is undermining the fabric of American culture, that homosexual relations are vile, depraved, hateful acts, that men can't actually become women, and vice versa, we shortchange our fellow man, since we deprive him of the opportunity to reform his life to bring it into harmony with right order. Hard sayings must be shouted loudly for the benefit of all mankind. Damn the consequences. Moreover, if retrogrades band together and resolve to be undeterred in our vocalization of unpopular truths, it will be impossible for big media and big business to ostracize us. The corporate goons in human resources won't be able to fire all of us. It's impossible to effectively silence such a significant segment of the population. The story of the Emperor's New Clothes serves as an uncannily apropos allegory for modern man's affinity for shrinking from his duty to proclaim truth. In the fable, the emperor is duped by two shysters into purchasing imaginary clothes, so that when he gets dressed in his new attire, in reality he's naked. Despite the fact that the emperor is humiliating himself by strutting around the town square in a full state of undress, none of the emperor's men or townspeople, for fear of appearing foolish or insolent, will speak out to tell the emperor that his wardrobe is a fraud. The people uniformly tickle the emperor's ear, complimenting his splendid linens and refined sartorial taste, except one little boy out of the whole town sees the emperor and, with umbrage in his voice, exclaims, "But the emperor isn't wearing any clothes! He's naked!" In the aftermath of this one child's naive candor, the people come to their senses and soberly admit the obvious. Truly, the emperor is not wearing any clothes. The weakness of mankind is such that the majority are content to go along with a lie out of fear of blowback should they stand and fight for truth. It's a somber realization that most people are consequentialists who would rather pretend a naked emperor is dressed in fine linen rather than risk looking foolish, or worse yet, risk a stint in the dungeon. At the same time, we should take solace that a lone voice, even that of a child, bravely crying out in the wilderness, is often sufficient to call men to their senses, to call men away from mass delusion. Be the lone voice in your locale, and soon we will marshal a network of woke retrogrades, ready to turn the tides of a war we've been long losing. The only precondition for the death of the gospel is silence. Never be cowed. Always speak truth, especially when it's unpopular. Hold fast to the musings of George Washington. I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man.
And that was Rule 3 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Peace be with you. Friends, today I want to do something I don't usually do, which is to preach on the second reading. During these last several weeks, we've been reading from Paul's letter to the Romans. And, maybe in another year, I could just focus on this magnificent text. Paul to the Romans is one of the great texts in our whole tradition. Paul is the first theologian. He's the first person really to think the Christian thing through in a very disciplined way. Because, of course, all his letters predate the Gospels. Romans, written sometime maybe in the late 50s of the first century. It's Paul's longest and most systematic statement of Christian faith. Almost every major theme in theology is in Romans. Whitehead said that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. You could say all of Christian theology is a footnote to Paul. And Paul is at his fullest expression in the letter to the Romans. So you get the impression I think it's an important letter. Well, today we have a very interesting, famous passage. And I'm just going to read it to you. It's very brief. Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How inscrutable are his judgments, how unsearchable his ways. You probably heard that passage. It comes at the culmination of a section of Romans chapters 9 through 11, where Paul is talking about the problem of Israel and the church. And I'm not going to go into that. That's not my point today. But it's a famously thorny problem. So Israel is the chosen people. Paul is an Israelite. And he recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. He's the fulfillment of Israel. And he makes that announcement, and some people accept it, but to be frank, most of Israel doesn't accept his message. So what's the relationship between the majority of Israelites who have rejected the message and those few Israelites and Gentiles who've accepted it? How do you think together, Israel the chosen people, but Christ the fulfillment of Israel, etc.? as I say, I'm not going to go into that. Take a look at Romans 9 to 11 for the details. The point is, it culminates with this famous line. When Paul is trying to search through this mystery, this confounding problem. And he says, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how inscrutable are his judgments, how unsearchable his ways. I do a lot of debate and dialogue with non-believers. Very often when agnostics and atheists attack the faith, it's along the lines of, how could an all-knowing and all-good God allow, now fill in the blank, the suffering of children, or allow natural catastrophes, or allow animals to suffer the way they do, allow leukemia in a 5-year-old. These are just so anomalous. How could you possibly believe that an all-knowing, all-good God could allow these things? Much of the objection hinges upon the puzzle that is proposed by the existence of God. Well, see, here's a classic answer from within the heart of our tradition. I admit it, Paul says. I admit it. God's ways are confounding to us. How the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how inscrutable his judgments, how unsearchable his ways. So the atheist or the agnostic might say, well, isn't that neat? Isn't that an easy way out of the problem? We just say, it's a great mystery. Well, not really. We have to realize whom we're dealing with and whom we're talking about when we deal with and talk about God. As I've said many times before, God is not something in the world. So I'm looking around this studio where I'm recording these words. I can point to various objects and people. I can go outside and point to various activities, and I can read the paper about certain events. I can consult the scientists, and they tell me about things happening within the cosmos. Okay, those are all objects and events and experiences within the world. If I use philosophical language, those are all categorical things. They can be categorized. I can say, oh yeah, that's this type of thing, and that's something else. Oh yeah, that's where that thing ends and where that thing begins. These are all definable. Even the planet Jupiter, well, yeah, it's this massive object, but I can define it. I can set the limits to it. I can say, well, yeah, that's Jupiter, but that's Saturn over there. There's that person and here's this person. They're separate. They're definable. They're categorizable. Then there's God. The creator of all things. The reason why there's something rather than nothing. The explanation for the universe itself is not ingredient in the universe. Does that make sense? Is not a thing among others within the universe. I think very often the atheists and agnostics make that fundamental error. They think of God as some big object. Some say it's there, some say it's not. Let's go find out. But that's what God is not. Therefore, God, in our great tradition, is described as being totaliter aliter. That means not just other, like Jupiter is other than Saturn. God is totaliter aliter. That means he's totally other. God can't be compared to anything within the world. It's not as though, well, here's this thing and then there's God over there. Well, then I could define God. Even that word, definition, define. Finis in Latin means a limit. To define something is to set a limit to it. God can't be defined. God can't be delimited. Therefore, he can't be contrasted with or compared with anything in the world. Now, start reading the mystics on this. This means that God can't be seen. Now, don't think of that as, well, there's some visible things floating around, and there's some invisible things like, atoms and all that. But no, God is in principle invisible. He can never come within the scope of my senses or of my mind. When I move into the reality of God, I'm going to that place. I'll quote you two here, but they're relying on the mystics, where the streets have no names. Right? If the streets have names, I kind of know where I'm going. Think when you get in your car. We all do it now. Just put your address in the GPS and it follows the route and it knows the names of the streets and you get where you're going to go. But see, when you're dealing with God, who's not a thing in the world, you're going into a place where the streets have no name. That's why there's that great text in our mystical tradition called the cloud of unknowing. Beautiful, isn't it? Think of the cloud on Mount Sinai, the cloud that signals the presence of God. It's a cloud of unknowing. I can't see. I don't know where I'm going. I can't get my bearings. The depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How inscrutable are his judgments. How unsearchable his ways. Why is God doing what God is doing? I don't know. And that's not a cop-out answer. You see my point? That's the only answer I can coherently give, given the nature of God. Now, let me take it a step further. So that's the undefinable quality of God. But God is also a person. God's not some dumb, object or force. God is a person. I don't know about you, but persons are always mysterious. And I'm talking here about human persons. If you meet somebody and you can look at them and size them up and your senses tell you a lot of things about them, you can read about them, you can Google them and find out information about them. That's all true. But a person always remains elusive and mysterious. Because the person has got a hidden, secret identity that is apparent to you only when the person reveals it. Isn't it interesting that married couples, married for 40, 50 years, will say, my husband or my wife is now more mysterious to me than she was before. That makes perfect sense to me. Perfect sense that the more you delve into a human person, the stranger, more elusive and mysterious that person becomes. Now, combine these two things. God is an infinite, undefinable person. Therefore, how inscrutable his judgments, how unsearchable his ways. Stay with that last phrase for a second. Think of a little child in relation to his parents, a little 3 or 4 year old. And, the 3 or 4 year old understands, my parents love me, but man, do they do strange, inscrutable things. Forcing me to go to bed when I don't want to. Telling me I can't do this or that. And that's the very thing I want. But when I'm hungry for something and they tell me, no, I can't have it. They take me to this guy wearing a white coat and he sticks needles in me. And I don't know what they're doing. If a child could be given the vocabulary of St. Paul, he would say, vis-a-vis his parents, how inscrutable they are. How unsearchable their judgments. I don't know what they're doing. Somehow I know these two people love me, but boy, do they do strange things to express it. Well, obviously, the little kid doesn't have the capaciousness of mind to take in what his parents understand, why they don't give him candy before dinner, why they make him go to bed, why they bring him to a doctor who gives him shots, etc. Parents get it, but the child in principle can't get it. Now, take that, everybody, and lift it to the infinite degree. The difference between our consciousness and God's consciousness. The difference between us and this infinite, indefinable person who is God. Is it puzzling that his judgments seem pretty strange and inscrutable to us? How could God allow such a thing to happen to me? And we've all experienced it. I get it. Any religious person. In fact, the more religious you are, the more you're going to feel this. How could God allow? Now, fill in the blank. Why do we think for a second that we should be able fully to understand the judgments of God? No, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. You say, okay, well then where am I left? You know where you're left, I think, where we're all left, is in the attitude of that child vis-a-vis his parents. I know these people love me. I know that at some deep instinctual level. But I don't understand why they do everything they do. But yet, I will trust. Yet, I will trust. And see, now we come, everybody, and I'll close with this. We come to the central teaching of St. Paul, which is what he calls faith. But see, faith, don't think of it propositionally, first of all, as accepting certain propositions. Think of faith as meaning this existential trust. I'm justified, Paul says, by faith, by this trust in God, whose ways and judgments I know remain inscrutable to me. We are relating to an infinite, indefinable person who loves us. Therefore, in him, we place our trust. And God bless you.
And that was Bishop-barron, When God's Ways Are Confusing. Back in a minute.
Lord Rush-Limbaugh is on by the Rush Hawkins Singers is exactly what's called for. Rush Limbaugh's on.
Thank you. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. And until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.